When the first distress call came from Dakathani, no one listened. When the last one came, no one could. Captain Elias Ward sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his hands folded on the metal table. His skin, weathered by time and battles long forgotten, looked pale under the flickering light. Across from him, Detective Aaron Holt studied him with quiet suspicion. A recording device sat between them, its red light blinking, a small, steady heartbeat in an otherwise silent room. Ward exhaled slowly, the weight of decades pressing on his shoulders. "You ever see something so terrifying that your own mind refuses to remember it?" he asked, voice rough like sandpaper. Holt leaned forward. "Captain, the official report says Dakathani was lost due to a catastrophic system failure. No survivors. No battle. Just an accident." Ward chuckled bitterly. "An accident? Is that what they're calling it now?" He shook his head, eyes distant. "I used to believe that too. I tried to believe it. But memories have a way of clawing their way back in." Holt narrowed his eyes. "You're the last known survivor. If you have information about what happened, we need to know." Ward hesitated. He had spent years trying to forget. He had drowned his memories in alcohol, in the quiet hum of solitude, in the hollow comfort of knowing no one would ever ask him about Dakathani again. But here it was. The past had found him. He swallowed. "The distress calls," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't warnings. They weren't cries for help." Holt frowned. "Then what were they?" Ward's jaw tightened. "They were lures." Silence stretched between them. Holt checked the recording device, adjusting the volume. "You're telling me the distress calls were meant to bring people to the colony?" Ward's hands trembled as he reached for the cup of water in front of him. His grip tightened around it as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The first few calls were real. The colonists were begging for help. They were still human then. Holt's breath caught. Then? Ward's fingers drummed against the table. He looked up, eyes dark and haunted. "They changed," he murmured. "Something changed them." Holt shifted uncomfortably. "The official records. The records are lies." Ward snapped, slamming his hand on the table. His voice echoed off the walls, sending a shiver down Holt's spine. "Do you really think an entire colony just vanishes without a trace? No wreckage. No bodies. No signs of struggle. Just emptiness." Holt was silent. Ward leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That's not how massacres happen." Holt stiffened. "You're calling it a massacre?" Ward nodded. "Not the kind you're thinking of. There were no armies. No explosions. No gunfire. But make no mistake, something killed them. And it didn't leave behind corpses." Holt's pulse quickened. "Then what did it leave behind?" Ward's lips parted, but for a long moment, he said nothing. His hands clenched into fists. His voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper. "Echoes." Holt shivered. Ward exhaled shakily. "The last transmission we picked up from Dakathani. I still hear it sometimes, in my dreams. It wasn't screaming. It wasn't panic. It was just a voice." Holt adjusted in his seat. "And what did the voice say?" Ward closed his eyes. The words still clung to him, like a ghost that had never truly left. "We are not alone." The recording device flickered. A soft, high-pitched distortion crackled through the speakers. And then, just for a second, something whispered back. Dakathani was a jewel among the outer colonies, at least, that's what the promotional brochures claimed. A thriving settlement on the edge of human expansion, it was meant to be a beacon of progress, a new home for thousands. For Governor Hale, it was the pinnacle of his career. He stood in the heart of Dakathani Prime, watching the twin suns set over the glass-domed skyline. The city's central plaza bustled with merchants, engineers, and families enjoying the cool evening air. Children laughed as they chased one another across the artificial grass, their voices carrying through the dome's reinforced structure. Everything felt safe. Secure. But that was before the lights started flickering. Hale frowned, watching as the street lamps dimmed, then buzzed back to life with an unnatural hum. He turned to his aide, Dr. Evelyn Carter, a no-nonsense scientist who had warned him, repeatedly, about the colony's unstable power grid. Another surge? Hale asked. Dr. Carter checked her wrist console, her brow furrowing. Not just a surge, she muttered. Something's disrupting the grid. It's not coming from our generators. Hale exhaled sharply. Then where is it coming from? Before she could answer, a low, unearthly vibration shuddered through the ground. The glass dome trembled. The streetlights flickered again, then died completely. A second later, the colony plunged into darkness. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd as emergency backup lights struggled to activate. Hale tapped his comm link. Control, report. What's going on? Silence. Then, static. A soft, unintelligible whispering. Hale frowned. Repeat that, Control. You're breaking up. More static. Then, suddenly, a voice. Governor. Hale's blood ran cold. The voice was not from Control. Dr. Carter took a step back, her face pale. Sir, that's coming from below us. Hale's breath caught in his throat. Below? That was impossible. The colony's foundation sat atop an empty cavern, a geological anomaly that had made terraforming easier. Nothing lived beneath Dakathani. Right? The comm link screamed. A high-pitched, ear-splitting screech burst from the speakers, sending dozens of colonists to their knees, clutching their heads. Hale ripped the device from his ear, eyes wide with horror. Then, silence. The lights blinked back on. The streets were illuminated again, and the colony looked the same as before. But something was different. People stood frozen in place, faces twisted in confusion and fear. Some of them were whispering. But their lips weren't moving. Hale turned sharply to Dr. Carter. Tell me you heard that. She swallowed hard. I heard something. But that wasn't interference, Governor. That was, she trailed off, her face tight with unease. That was a voice. Hale's gut twisted. And then, the first distress call came in. Scene break, the first call for help. 2 miles from the city center, deep inside the colony's agricultural sector, a frantic voice crackled over the emergency channels. This is Engineer First Class Henry Lewis, requesting immediate assistance. We have a breach, repeat, a breach in Sector 7. The transmission cut off. Governor Hale reacted instantly. Security, get a team to Sector 7, now. He and Dr. Carter rushed to Mission Control, where the colony surveillance feeds should have shown exactly what happened. Instead, the screen displayed static. Security Chief Jonas Reed, a hardened veteran, scowled at the monitors. Someone's jamming our visuals. Who? Hale demanded. Pirates? Rebels? Reed shook his head grimly. It's not external. He pointed at the readings. The signal's coming from inside the colony. Dr. Carter went pale. That's not possible. Tell that to the screens, Reed muttered. Then, for a brief second, the feed flashed back to life. And what they saw froze them in place. Sector 7 was empty. No workers. No machinery running. Just rows of crops swaying in the artificial wind, and a single human silhouette standing perfectly still in the middle of the field. Hale's stomach dropped. "Is that Lewis?" Reed enhanced the image. The figure wasn't moving. No breathing. No blinking. Just standing. Then, suddenly, the figure turned. And that's when they realized, it had no face. The screen cut to black. Hale took a slow, shaky breath. The second distress call came 30 seconds later. "For the love of God, help us." Then, silence. Dakathani was dying. No alarms had been raised. No enemy ships had landed. And yet, one by one, the colonists were disappearing. Governor Hale couldn't explain it. The first night after the power surge, 10 people failed to report for their shifts. Their homes were untouched. Their belongings remained. But they were gone, as if they had simply walked out into the night and never returned. By the second day, 30 more were missing. By the end of the week, nearly 100 people had vanished, without a single trace of violence. Scene 1, The Vanishing. Captain Elias Ward leaned against the railing of the colony's upper observation deck, scanning the empty streets below. Dakathani Prime, once bustling with life, now felt eerily hollow. He checked his comms. Still no response from command. Every outgoing message was met with static. They were cut off. He turned as Security Chief Jonas Reed approached, his face grim. "Another 20 last night," Reed said quietly. "All of them from Sector 9. Ward clenched his jaw. "And no one heard a thing?" Reed shook his head. No signs of a struggle. No signs of anything. He hesitated before adding, "Sir, I don't think these people are just missing." Ward eyed him warily. "What are you saying?" Reed took a deep breath. "I checked the logs. Some of them came back." Ward stiffened. "Came back?" Reed nodded. Surveillance caught 3 of the missing returning to their homes in the early hours of the morning. No one saw them come in. They just appeared, standing in their own doorways, staring at the walls. A chill ran down Ward's spine. And? Reed swallowed hard. By sunrise, they were gone again. Scene 2, The First Survivor. Hale and Dr. Carter stood in medbay, staring down at the first person to be found alive after disappearing. It was Henry Lewis. Except, it wasn't. His body was intact, uninjured. But his skin was ice cold, and his eyes were black, as if the pupils had swallowed the color whole. He sat on the examination table, motionless. He didn't respond to touch. He didn't blink. Carter swallowed. "Henry?" His lips moved. But the voice that came out wasn't his. "I see you." Hale felt his breath hitch. "What?" Lewis's head tilted at an unnatural angle. His lips didn't match the words that followed. "You were never supposed to be here." The lights flickered. The medbay monitors spiked with activity, but the heart rate scanner flatlined. Lewis wasn't breathing. He was dead. Yet, he was speaking. Then, without warning, he lunged. Carter screamed as Lewis grabbed her wrist, his fingers ice-cold and impossibly strong. "You have to leave," he rasped, his voice his own again. "Get out before they..." His body convulsed. Then, he collapsed. A second later, his body shriveled, turning into a brittle, hollow husk. Scene 3, The Whispering Night. Ward sat on the edge of his bunk that night, gripping his pistol. He hadn't slept in 2 days. Across the colony, people had begun hearing things. Whispers in the vents. Footsteps in empty hallways. Some claimed to see figures standing in their doorways at night, watching. No one spoke of it during the day. No one wanted to admit what they already knew. Dakathani was under siege. But there was no army. No enemy. Just absence. Ward stared at the dimly glowing comm panel on his desk. He was about to record a message to command when he heard it. A voice. Not through the speakers. Not over the radio. It was inside the room. Elias. Ward froze. Slowly, he turned. Something stood in the doorway. Not a person. Not quite. It was the shape of a man. But its face was featureless, its body wrapped in shifting shadows. It shouldn't have been real. But it was. Ward raised his weapon. Who the hell are you? The figure didn't move. Didn't react. But then. It spoke. You remember. Ward's heart slammed against his ribs. Then, it vanished. No sound. No movement. Just, gone. The door never opened. The locks were still sealed. And yet, the whisper remained. You remember. The colony was dying, but not in the way anyone expected. There were no fires, no explosions, no battle. And yet, one by one, the people of Dakathani were vanishing. Some returned, but they weren't the same. Others simply ceased to exist, as if they had never been there in the first place. Captain Elias Ward had seen many horrors in his time. But nothing like this. Scene 1, the underground facility. The deeper Ward and Security Chief Jonas Reed dug into the records, the more they realized something wasn't right. Dr. Evelyn Carter confirmed it, the colony's official documentation didn't match reality. Dakathani was established 50 years ago. But the geological surveys, the infrastructure reports, they were much older. At least 100 years older. There's something beneath us, Carter whispered, staring at the decrypted files. Something we were never meant to find. Ward's gut twisted. That night, they went looking. Armed with floodlights and weapons, Ward, Reed, and Carter ventured into the colony's subterranean tunnels, following the abnormal energy signals that had plagued Dakathani since the power surge. They moved carefully, the air growing colder the deeper they went. Then, they found the doors. Massive, rusted bulkheads sealed long before the colony was built. The walls around them were covered in markings, not human, not alien, but something entirely different. Ward's blood ran cold. This isn't part of the colony. Carter checked her scanner. No. It was built long before us. Reed found a control panel, covered in dust but still active. One single button blinked red. Warning, containment breach. Ward clenched his jaw. Open it. Reed hesitated. You sure about that? Ward nodded. With a deep breath, Reed pressed the button. The bulkhead doors groaned, ancient mechanisms grinding to life. Then, they slid open. And behind them, they saw the impossible. Scene 2, the Chamber of Echoes. The room was vast, stretching beyond the limits of their floodlights. The walls shifted, as though they weren't made of metal, but something more, alive. Strange statues lined the space, humanoid in shape, but featureless, faceless, just like the figures seen in the colony. Carter's hands trembled. This is a tomb. Ward stepped forward, scanning the walls. His breath caught. Because there were names carved into the metal. Not alien names. Human names. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Ward's own name was among them. His pulse spiked. What the hell is this? Reed whispered. Then, the whispers returned. You were never supposed to be here. The statues shifted. And one of them turned its head. Scene 3, the first death. The air grew heavier, thick with something unnatural. The temperature plunged. The statues weren't statues. They were people. People who had been forgotten. Reed stumbled back, gripping his rifle. "Ward, we have to go." But it was too late. One of the figures moved, faster than any human could react. It grabbed Reed's wrist. His entire body convulsed. Ward watched in horror as Reed's face went blank, his eyes darkened, his mouth forming a silent scream. Then, he was gone. Not dead. Not unconscious. Just, gone. His body collapsed into dust. His name disappeared from the wall. Like he had never existed. Carter gasped. "They're erasing us." Ward's breath came sharp and fast. "We have to move. Now." They turned to run. And found the exit blocked. Figures stood in the doorway, faceless shadows watching them. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke. "You should never have remembered." They were surrounded. The faceless figures stood motionless in the doorway, their hollow gazes fixed on Ward and Dr. Carter. No breathing. No movement. Just watching. Behind them, the ancient chamber of echoes loomed, its shifting walls whispering words that had no sound. Ward tightened his grip on his weapon. It felt useless. What good was firepower against something that could erase people from existence? Jonas Reed was gone. No trace left behind, not even in memory. His name had vanished. Ward swallowed hard. "We have to move." Carter's breath was shaky, her mind barely processing what she had seen. "Ward, they're not attacking." Ward hesitated. She was right. The figures stood in place, unmoving. They weren't advancing. They were waiting. For what? Then, one of them spoke. "You do not belong here." The voice was not human. It was layered, distorted, as if 1,000 voices spoke at once. Ward's heart slammed against his ribs. He raised his gun. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head. "You remember." Ward's grip on his weapon tightened. "I don't know what you mean." The whispers around them grew louder. The walls shuddered. Then, suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward. The moment it moved, Carter screamed. Scene 1, the truth of the faceless ones. The creature reached toward Ward. Not fast, not aggressive, almost gentle. Ward jerked back but forced himself to hold his ground. It lowered its arm. Then, in an instant, Ward saw. A flood of memories that weren't his slammed into his mind. Faces. Voices. People he didn't know, yet somehow, he did. A colony ship. Not Dakathani, but another one. The first settlers. The real first settlers. A failed experiment. And then, the purge. Ward staggered back, his breath sharp and uneven. This isn't the first time. Carter turned to him, confused. What? He pointed at the figures. They were like us. Colonists. People. Her eyes widened. You mean, they were erased? The figures stood silent. Ward clenched his jaw. Not just erased. He looked up at the shifting walls. They were trapped here. Carter's blood ran cold. Ward, if that's true, then this place isn't a tomb. It's a prison. The figure in front of them slowly nodded. Scene 2, the last transmission. The whispers intensified. The walls began to shift faster. The faceless figures turned their heads in unison. Something was coming. Ward grabbed Carter's arm. We have to go, now. They bolted toward the bulkhead doors, but the walls sealed shut. The air grew heavier. The whispering turned into a low, droning hum. Then, a sound broke through. A transmission. A voice, coming from Ward's comm device. Survivors of Dakathani, if you are hearing this, you have already been marked. Ward's blood turned to ice. The whispering stopped. The figures stiffened. We tried to stop it, the voice continued. But it does not want to be stopped. Carter's hands shook as she stared at the comm unit. That can't be. Ward's stomach dropped. Because the voice on the transmission was his own. Scene 3, The Sacrifice. The walls began to collapse inward. The figures moved now, stepping toward them with eerie, silent purpose. The truth was clear. There was no beating this thing. It was not a disease. Not a ghost. Not an invasion. It was a memory. And the only way to survive it was to forget. Ward turned to Carter, his mind racing. There had to be a way. Then, he saw it. The control panel. The failsafe. It was a reset. A way to erase the entire colony from existence. To trap the entity again. But it required one thing. A sacrifice. Someone had to stay behind. Carter realized it at the same time he did. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. We can find another way. Ward shook his head. There wasn't. He grabbed her wrist, forcing his comm unit into her palm. You have to go. Her eyes filled with panic. Ward. He shoved her toward the exit. The figures were closing in, but they weren't after her. They only wanted him. She fought against him, but the doors began sealing behind her. Ward gave her one last look. Forget me. Then, the doors slammed shut. Carter's scream was the last thing he heard. Scene 4, The Erasure. Inside the chamber, Ward turned toward the control panel. The faceless figures surrounded him now, but they didn't attack. They waited. The whispers turned into words. You are ready. Ward exhaled, his hands steady as he reached for the failsafe. The figures bowed their heads. As if they had been waiting for him. As if this had always been his fate. He closed his eyes. And pressed the button. Scene 5, Carter's Escape. The colony was gone. Dr. Evelyn Carter stood on the evacuation ship, staring out the viewport as Dakathani faded into nothing. Not an explosion. Not a collapse. Just emptiness. A blank space where the colony had been. She gripped the comm unit in her hands. Ward's last message echoed in her head. Forget me. But she couldn't. And deep down, she knew something else. If she remembered him. It wasn't over. Dakathani was gone. Not destroyed. Not abandoned. Just erased. Dr. Evelyn Carter sat in the evacuation ship's dimly lit cabin, staring at the blank void where the colony had once been. Her hands trembled around the comm device Ward had forced into her palm. She should have felt relief, but all she felt was wrong. Because she still remembered. Scene 1, The Return to Civilization. The rescue ship docked at the nearest outpost, Horizon Station. Carter was rushed to debriefing, where government officials, military officers, and corporate representatives demanded answers. But what could she say? She tried to tell them about Dakathani, about the disappearances, the whispers, the faceless figures. But they didn't believe her. There was never a colony on Dakathani, one official said, frowning at his records. Are you feeling all right, Dr. Carter? Carter's blood ran cold. She slammed her fists on the table. That's not true. Thousands of people lived there. I was there. You sent me. The officials exchanged glances. One of them leaned forward, speaking slowly, as if to a child. Dr. Carter, we have no record of a settlement on Dakathani. As far as the United Earth Council is concerned, that planet was never colonized. Carter's mind reeled. She felt like she was falling through reality itself. They didn't remember. Just like Jonas Reed. Just like everyone else who vanished. The entity had won. It hadn't just erased the colony. It had erased its memory. And yet, she still remembered. Which meant it wasn't over. Scene 2, The Whispering returns. Carter was given a psychiatric evaluation. The doctors asked her about stress, exhaustion, hallucinations. She told them the truth. They didn't believe her. That night, she sat alone in her assigned quarters, staring at the comm device Ward had left her. The last message still played in her head. "Forget me." She squeezed the device, eyes burning. "I can't." A single notification light blinked on the screen. One new message. Carter's stomach twisted. She hadn't sent any transmissions. Heart pounding, she hesitantly pressed play. A voice crackled through the speakers. "Dr. Carter." Her breath caught. Because it was Ward's voice. But that was impossible. Ward was gone. The colony was gone. The transmission continued. "If you're hearing this, then it didn't work." Carter's heart slammed against her ribs. "It's still here." The lights flickered. And for the first time since she left Dakathani, she wasn't alone. Scene 3, The Final Warning. Carter grabbed a sidearm and backed into the corner of her room. The whispering started again. Not through the comms. Not over the station speakers. It was inside the room. The air grew cold. She turned toward the mirror on the wall. And froze. Her reflection wasn't hers. It was a faceless figure. Standing perfectly still. But it was watching her. Carter's breath came in short gasps. "No."
The whispering grew louder. And then, the reflection tilted its head. And spoke. "You remember." Carter's scream never left her throat. Dr. Evelyn Carter was running out of time. The whispers were getting louder. The faceless thing in the mirror hadn't moved, but she could feel it watching her. Ward's final transmission still played in her head. "If you're hearing this, then it didn't work. It's still here." The entity hadn't been contained. And now, it was coming for her. Scene 1, Nowhere to Run. Carter grabbed her comm device and bolted for the control center. She needed to send a warning, to someone, anyone, before she was erased like the others. She stormed into Horizon Station's command deck, gasping for breath. The officers on duty looked up in alarm. "I need a direct line to Earth Command," she panted. "Now." The comms officer, Lieutenant Park, frowned. "Dr. Carter, it's 0300 hours. What's going on?" She slammed her hands on the console. "I don't have time to explain. I need to send a distress call." She trailed off. Because on the comms panel, there was already a message. A distress call. And it was from her. Her stomach turned to ice. What the hell? Park hesitated, then pressed play. Her own voice came through the speakers. "This is Dr. Evelyn Carter of Horizon Station. If you're receiving this, forget everything you know about Dakathani. Forget me. Forget this message." The room went deathly silent. Carter's blood ran cold. She had never recorded this. The officer stared at her. "Doctor," Park's voice was quiet. "Careful. When did you send this transmission?" Carter's hand shook. "I didn't." The whispering returned. This time everyone heard it. The lights flickered. The room's temperature plunged. And then, the officers started disappearing. One by one, they vanished into thin air. No screams. No struggle. Just gone. Carter's pulse pounded in her ears. No, no, no. She grabbed Park's arm. We have to go. But his eyes were already darkening. His face slackened. And before she could say another word, he was gone. Scene 2, the last transmission. Carter was alone. The station was silent. No alarms. No emergency sirens. Because no one was left to hear them. She stumbled back toward the communications panel. Her only chance was to send the warning. Even if no one would believe her. Her fingers flew over the controls. A new recording. A final message. She took a deep breath. And pressed record. This is Dr. Evelyn Carter. If you are receiving this, you have to forget. Forget Dakathani. Forget me. Forget this message. She swallowed hard, blinking back the panic. It doesn't want to be known. The more you remember, the closer it gets. The whispering was right behind her now. She could feel it. Don't let it find you. Her reflection in the console shifted. It wasn't hers anymore. The whispering was inside her own mind now. Forget. Her voice wavered. Forget. Please. The recording cut to static. Then. Silence. Scene 3, the aftermath. Days later, a routine patrol ship passed by Horizon Station. There was no distress signal. No sign of trouble. The station was silent. Empty. As if no one had ever been there. The patrol crew scanned the logs. No records of a Dr. Evelyn Carter. No records of a Dakathani colony. No records of a missing crew. It was as if they had never existed. The officer in charge shook his head. Nothing here. Just another abandoned station. He turned to leave. And paused. For just a moment, he thought he heard something. A whisper. But when he turned, there was nothing there. Just silence. He shrugged, dismissing it. And walked away. Final twist, the endless cycle. Carter is gone. Erased, just like Ward. Horizon Station is empty. It's as if she and the crew never existed. The final patrol officer almost hears the whisper, but ignores it. The cycle begins again. The life lesson. Some horrors aren't meant to be remembered. Some truths must stay forgotten. Because once you know, it knows you too.